Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. On November 6th, we recorded a live show at the Building for Sustainability Symposium in Canmore, Alberta, which also happens to be where I live and where David lives when not off teaching. Thanks to the Biosphere Institute and the Bow Valley Builders and Developers Association for hosting us. The topic we tackled was what matters and really doesn't matter when it comes to building for sustainability. We thought it was a fun and lively conversation and hope you do too. Here's the show. Thank you, Mayor, and welcome everyone to a very special live taping of the Energy versus Climate podcast. My name is Ed Whittingham, as the Mayor said, and I'm joined by my podcast co-hosts Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. And as Sean said, we go way back. We're part of an improv troupe together many years ago. And I just want to say that the Mayor has promised that if we have a problem with David, who is joining us via Zoom from inside his EV in Kentucky, what could go wrong? That if for any reason we're to lose David and we lose his disembodied head, that the Mayor will jump up and he will improvise the role of David Keith for the duration of the show. And as we are wont to do when we perform together, I at some point, and unannounced to Sean, will fling myself at him and he will have to carry me and then do something improv with my much smaller body. So I just want to give you fair warning. So tonight's topic is what matters and really doesn't matter when it comes to building for sustainability. And we've not done a show on building sustainability ever before. And it's not for lack of sexiness. And that actually reminds me of a joke. Why is building for sustainability like high school students and sex? Because we talk about it a lot more than we actually do it. And those who are doing it aren't doing it very well. And you're going to tell us you're going to have to dispel that myth or not. But in all seriousness, building emissions are rising. They've risen since 2005. We're kind of disproportionately energy and climate geeks, so we'll focus a lot on that in this show. I'm going to quickly do a quick Q&A with my co-host David, who has recently built a house here on 2A Street in Canmore, and he's going to talk in a live case study-like way about some of the real design decisions that he made when thinking through building for sustainability. David, let's talk about your house for a bit.
I will.
And it's a beautiful house. How did you approach the design and the construction of the house? Like, what were the material decisions you made versus, in this theme of, what matters, what doesn't matter, the immaterial ones?
I'll get there. First, really sorry not to be there in person. I did promise Ed and Sarah that I'd do that, and I messed up my calendar. I'm actually sitting in really rural Kentucky where there's spectacular climbing, and as it happens, there's a lot of Canmore people, or Canmorons as I like to call them, right around here. In fact, I believe I parked my car outside one of the rural cabins that has Starlink that another Canmore couple is in. So maybe they'll come out and knock on the door. I'm sitting in my electric vehicle on remote Starlink. It's definitely the modern world in a very strange way. So onto this house. New build. Some big features were no gas line, so all electric. A bunch of attention to insulation, starting with kind of mundane stuff. We thought a little bit about thermal bridging, and so we have spray foam in ceilings and some other places, and outer warm board covering to manage the thermal bridging. So it's a really highly insulated structure. I guess one downside, and this is the trade-offs people always make, we have architectural concrete, which we really love the look of, but is bad for the climate because it's concrete, no question. For geothermal, this is, as is possible in, I think, a lot of Canmore, in the flat lower section of Canmore, there's very high permeability in the compacted mixed rock underneath you. So you can drill very shallow wells, sort of 15-meter deep wells, and get high flows. So on our property, we have one supply well and two return wells, although I don't think we needed the two. One of them would have done it. So these are pretty simple, comparatively cheap wells. And this is a direct system. So geothermal systems can either be closed loop, where you have deep wells typically, where you pump a fluid in a pipe down and back up to just have heat transfer to the walls of the tube, and then you have to have a lot of tubes. Or what we have, which is cheaper and simpler, which is you just are pumping water from the groundwater, pumping it through our system and pumping it back down. And so we'd be pumping water up at sort of 5 degrees centigrade or 6 or so, and pumping it back down at a couple degrees colder during the heating season. And then we're taking the heat out and keeping our house warm. So the heat exchanger is basically refrigerating the ground under your feet and my feet and heating our house for us. And more or less, it's all worked. So some comments about other design choices and about the system. One is about kind of the costs of saving, the costs in dollars a ton carbon terms of these saving energy in these various ways. So we got very high insulation value windows. For those of you who are engineers and think about metric, they're half a watt per degree Kelvin per square meter, which are, getting to be about as good as windows get. They're also look nice, but they cost, several hundred K. It was by far the biggest single line item of the whole house build. And when you are hard-nosed and try and do the math and you ask, what is the dollars per ton of avoided carbon for those windows compared to some other windows that would have been basically as nice but lower performance? It's always hard to make an exact comparison, but we had, it was a cost plus contract, so we would see a bunch of these things. The answer is sort of more than $1,000 a ton carbon. So that has me asking myself, why did I do that? Because I also found this company called Carbon Sharing, which thinks it can take CO2 out of the atmosphere for quite a lot less than $1,000 a ton carbon. So maybe we should have bought an offset. I think in practice, I really believe it is worth saving energy at the source and not just buying offsets. But I think the point is not all energy savings make sense. And you need to think about how many dollars a ton carbon the saving is, because we can't just spend money indiscriminately. A couple other design choices. We did not choose to do solar, and that's because of my view that the grid is extremely efficient. North American grid overall is sort of 96% efficient or so. So solar in Canmore has comparatively low capacity factor. That is, it doesn't operate enough of the year, partly because of the shade from the mountain. And also individual rooftop solar is fairly high maintenance costs. So from my perspective, I'd much rather pay for solar in southern Alberta. And one way to think about it is that for a given amount of dollars, I get more solar or more reduced carbon by using a big solar facility in southern Alberta, and was actually involved in developing one of those, than anything I would put on my house. So from my perspective, I'm perfectly happy to have people put solar in their house, but I actually think it's not a sensible choice compared to just using solar from the grid. But while we're on the top of the grid, here's a big thing that our house does not do, and it should do, and this is part of the lessons for doing things better. The carbon intensity of the Alberta grid varies with time quite quickly. When it's the middle of the day and the wind is blowing strongly, so you've got good wind and solar supply, the carbon intensity can be very low. But at night, when obviously there's no solar, and if it's a calm night with not much wind, the carbon intensity will be a lot higher. The carbon intensity varies sharply with time and with the dispatch of different systems on the grid. And it's somewhat predictable. So not only could you know it instantaneously, but you have a decent ability in grids to predict sort of a day or so ahead what the carbon intensity will be. So the sensible way to use geothermal, if you care about carbon, which is the reason for us to spend the money and do this, is to dispatch, that is turn on and off the heat pump in a way that's smart with respect to the grid intensity. So we, in our house, the house itself has a big thermal mass, so it's quite slow to respond because it's highly insulated and we have floors that have some concrete in them. And also, there's a big storage tank that we bought for that purpose. So with sensible dispatch, you could run the system so that when it anticipated or was very low carbon intensity, the system would heat the house up a little more than the set point and heat up the storage tank. And then when maybe it's early morning and people are all turning on and the grid carbon intensity spikes, it would not use electricity. Those subtle changes can be a very cost-effective way to save carbon, more cost-effective than buying a battery. It's kind of using the smartness of the grid and the smartness of dispatch of turning things on and off as an effective battery. So we don't do that. I've been talking with Sarah a little bit, and we should hire a student and write some software and do that. I'm a professor. It's my business. I've got the money. I can do it, but that's obviously silly for an individual person to do it. And if I do it, we'll do it to make it free and, hopefully promote it. But the point here is that there isn't right now a facility where a contractor has all that knowledge to do it. And to be clear, once somebody's written the software for this grid carbon intensity dispatch, it'd basically be effectively free to install that software. All the controls are already in our house. It's just nobody's done that. So stepping back a little bit more, our house, we were lucky to have the money to build a relatively expensive house. The geothermal heat like this is still pretty high capital cost. It gets much more cost effective in multi-unit buildings. So thinking about what's going to happen in Canmore, and to some extent what's already happened, Spring Creek has one. If you took a system very much like was what we built in our house, but did that for a couple unit dwelling, even one of those kind of fourplex type dwellings, and if you did it with that carbon odor dispatch, then you can get to, I think, much more cost effective ways to actually reduce carbon emissions that really have a big benefit, which I don't think we've achieved so well in our house. I think there's a bunch of lessons like that about how to set up the sort of regulatory and incentive system. Maybe I'll pause there. Ed, is that the kind of thing you were looking for?
Yeah, so thanks, David. And I want to come back to a couple points around these design decisions, including something like, do you install a heat pump? Do you install a solar array? I will challenge you in having installed solar arrays on 2 houses in the Bow Valley, including on my Canmore house, a 3.9 kilowatt system. I have not incurred any OPEX so far. There's no kind of bathtub-like curve that you might get with other renewable electricity or utility scale renewable electricity facilities that you have to pay. And so as far as I can see, it's steel, glass, and wires, and the OPEX is virtually nil for the lifetime of the 30 years. But let's come back to that and come back to cost of abatement, and I'm sure we'll talk about public policy decisions and what mayors like Mayor Krausert here is willing to spend on a per ton basis on local incentives. But I want to turn to Sarah, and I'd mentioned off the top that building emissions in Canada, although emissions in Canada overall have decreased, albeit slightly, from 2005 levels. And our target is 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, which I can tell you we have a near zero chance of actually achieving. We have snowball's chance in hell of actually achieving that target. But we have managed to bring emissions down. But building emissions have gone the opposite way. They've gone up by 8.8% since 2005. And Sarah, why is that? What are we doing wrong compared to, say, what we're doing right with electricity grids in Canada?
Well, thanks for warning me that this was going to be on the exam so I could look up some answers before. And, I think it's actually similar to most sectors and most things when we talk about emissions. It's the overall trends are really important to understand, but in order to actually understand what's going on, you have to dig into, what's behind this overall, slight increase. And so there's sort of 2 separate things going on in 2 parts of the building sector. You have the residential building sector, which accounts for a little bit less than half of the emissions in Canada, and then you have kind of commercial, institutional service buildings, which is a little bit more than the other half. And things are actually very different within those 2 sectors. So if we look at the residential sector, and I'm taking an even broader snapshot going all the way back to 1990, you had 2 main things that were leading to emissions to increase in that sector about equally. One is just population growth. So we have more people, so you have more buildings, and that generates more emissions. You also, though, almost equally in size, have an increase in the floor space per person. So this is basically homes getting bigger and each individual person in a home having more space. And that was almost as large as the growth in emissions from the population growth. Now, more or less exactly balancing that was actually improvements in energy efficiency in buildings. Quite a bit of those, I think, also coming from things like lighting efficiency and others. Although, now that I've said that, actually, I think that these are the numbers that exclude electricity emissions. They're just the direct emissions. So scratch that. It is the heating and hot water efficiency that was improving there. So net, you have bigger population, people having bigger homes, but those homes are getting more efficient. And on the whole, the residential sector actually improved slightly in efficiency. And then you have the commercial sector where you had, again, a growth in the amount of floor space. So, more buildings being built for, people to go and do commercial and service activities in, and not a lot of efficiency improvements that were offsetting that. You have a few, little things in the noise around changes in fuel mix, but on the whole, it's kind of staying about flat. And so that led to that increase. So you add those 2 together, you have, improvements on the residential side, but blunted by population growth and floor space growth, to a commercial sector that didn't really have much in the way of efficiency improvements, and that gets you this growing building sector emissions. I will note, these are like emissions data always is. It's slightly lagging, right? And so we're talking about 2021 or 2022 perhaps. And so some of the things that we're starting to see happen, especially across Canada, when we talk about things like electrification of hot water heating and building heating, are not yet really showing up in those numbers. So I imagine, when we're back in 5 years for the 6th annual conference, we may already see some differences in those numbers there, but it's a little bit early on that count.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That's really useful context. David, I want to go back to you and get your opinion. So no one is going to stop individual homeowners like yourself or like myself or Sarah in Calgary from going ahead and on the homeowner's dime doing things like putting in heat pumps, solar arrays, insulation, increased wall thickness, whatever it is, and even if the cost per ton is high. That's your individual right as a homeowner, and as long as you're not going and seeking public money for it, then no one would contest it. But when it comes to spending public money, then let's just bring it back locally and let's look at numbers. So Canmore's overall emissions footprint is 250,000 tons per year. By comparison, Lafarge, its Exshall plant just down valley from here, is 1.2 megatons per year, so 5 times larger. And then Syncrude, if you look at its oil sands plant, is 12 megatons per year. So you can make the case that what Lafarge does is 5 times more impactful than what Canmore does, and what Syncrude does is about 50 times. So David, in terms of what we should be going after in order to get to this extremely ambitious target that Canada has, and on public money, should we not tell the federal and provincial governments that focus all your efforts on these big point source industrial facilities and give communities like Canmore a pass and let them do what they want to do, providing individual citizens are paying for it out of their own pockets? What do you think?
Not quite, because partly you're singling out Canmore, which happens to be small. It's a small town we love, but it's not that different. I mean, it's different in lots of ways we care about, but fundamentally it's not that different from lots of other Canadian housing. And collectively, all of the housing in Canada is a big contributor. So I think comparing the fact that Canmore happens to be small with Lafarge that happens to be a giant point source, obviously when you say it that way, you think, why bother with Canmore? But on the same logic, you could compare Canmore and one person's house in Toronto and say, well, compare Lafarge and one person's house in Toronto and say, well, that doesn't matter because the house is so small. The point is there are so many houses. So I think that, I don't think you're saying this, but it sort of seemed like it was going that way in that comparison. I think the building sector does matter. And I think the question of how much effort government should put into the building sector, both commercial and residential buildings, compared to big point sources, really depends on estimates of the actual costs of emissions mitigation between those two sectors. Because to me, the climate problem is big. It is in lots of senses an emergency, but we don't have infinite money. There are other problems that society has. And so we need to think seriously about the relative cost of different ways to save emissions. And my sense is, if it is true that it's much cheaper to cut emissions at big point sources than in the whole housing sector, then yes, I would say do it at big point sources. But I'm not sure it's true. In practice, I think that's true at some point sources and not others. And I think there are some relatively low cost things we could do in the housing sector, and therefore we should. So I'm kind of rejecting the Canmore versus Lafarge comparison. I think the real question is, what is the relative cost of cutting in different places? And I don't think we know so well. I also think the oil sands are particularly different because they're part of an industry that makes carbon, which in the long run we're going to shift away from. And so my view is concrete is going to be needed in a long, long time. It's now up to, if I remember right, about 6% of global. And we need to find a way to make low carbon concrete. It's less clear that we ever really need to find a way to make low carbon oil sands, since the problem with oil sands is the product, and eventually we're going to move away from it.
Hi there, everyone. Ed here with a favor to ask. Energy versus climate is a labor of love. David, Sarah, and I don't pay ourselves for the show because we feel strongly about the public service benefit of the project. We also don't run ads or take on sponsors in order to maintain 100% editorial independence. But the show still costs money to make. What little we do bring in from donors goes directly to paying our producer to make the pod and run our website. You can help us keep Energy versus Climate on the air by making a tax-deductible donation to the show today at energyversusclimate.com/donate. Thanks for your support. So with concrete, if Lafarge, Heidelberg, these cement plants we have in Alberta, were to put in capture systems, carbon capture and storage systems that would capture 95% of their emissions, it would double the cost of the cement and therefore the concrete to the homeowner. However, when you actually round that out in terms of overall building costs, it's 1%. So on an individual line item, it's very expensive. When you take it as a total cost of building a house or building a commercial building, it's 1% or less. So we can do it, and it's exciting that Lafarge and Heidelberg and these cement plants in Alberta are moving very seriously on these projects. But Sarah, I want to go to heat. So what can we do about heat? Because we live in a cold climate. Arguably, heat matters, and what matters and doesn't matter for building sustainability. Heat matters, but it's expensive and it's hard. What should we be doing? Should we be electrifying heat and generating more electricity? Should we be putting in heat pumps, better envelopes, or should we be just trying to decarbonize natural gas? Or actually, should we be going to the federal government and trying to get a carbon tax carve out for home natural gas consumption? And we won't call it a regional bone that they're throwing. What should we be doing?
I heard that there was a proposal to subsidize installation of heating oil systems in Alberta, which are incredibly more expensive than natural gas, but you could avoid paying the carbon tax. I don't know how far that's going to go. I don't think we should do that, for the record. I just wanted to add on to, and it links to the heat piece. I think this question of, more important and which sector we should go after is really different now than, if we'd been having this podcast 5-10 years ago. And the idea that we have a future net zero target, I think, really changes the game, because there is sort of, modulo maybe a bit of emissions that are really hard to abate, that we have to use things like direct air capture to go after. We sort of have to go after them all. And then the question becomes also, how do you do that? And is it public dollars that you're, providing as subsidies, or is it regulations, or is it other approaches as well too? When it comes to heat, it is very important, right? And the vast majority of emissions from buildings, once you exclude electricity, of course, have to do with heating the space and heating the water that we use. And obviously those are critical things, especially here in Alberta. We need to decarbonize our electricity grid to clean up the electricity emissions that we use, but that's through some mix of rooftop solar and others. When it comes to heat, it does, and I think this is another thing that gets repeated, from sector to sector. It's not as hard as it used to be, I'll say, when it comes to heat pumps, right? And there is a change in that, until recently, it was the case that we didn't have low temperature heat pumps, and heat pumps didn't work, all that well below -10, maybe -5, which in most places of the world is probably, more than enough, but not enough for us here in Alberta. There are now low temperature heat pumps that work pretty well down to about -25. Below that, they do need supplemental heating from resistance heat. But it is, from a technical perspective, it's certainly harder, but it's not impossible. It's more costly, although even, the Canadian Climate Institute had a nice comparison of costs of electrifying heating using heat pumps across Canada. And their headline number says that, in Edmonton, it's more expensive to electrify a single-family home with a heat pump than it is to use gas, primarily, partially because gas is very cheap, and of course it gets very cold there. But they made a very conservative estimate in that they were keeping the natural gas hookup to the home. And that comes with a substantial amount of cost. If you look at your natural gas bill, the amount you pay for the natural gas versus the amount that you're paying for the distribution system, that latter one is pretty large. And so actually, if you completely get off gas in a home, even in Edmonton, you can do so over the lifetime of the heat pump in a way that is actually less expensive than using gas. So there is, I think, a real possibility and a real potential here to look at electrifying our building stock. I think there's also really real barriers out there when it comes to kind of awareness of that opportunity. And of course, there are the barriers that come from the upfront cost. So you may be paying more for that equipment up front and having, a lower cost of ownership over the lifetime. But when you look at sort of from a total cost perspective, it is something that's possible. And then I think it becomes a question of, what's the right way for governments to intervene and make that happen. It's probably reasonable that may happen slightly more slowly in places that are the coldest, and where that is the most challenging. But that said, certainly in so much as we're starting to look at things like installing air conditioning in more and more homes in Alberta as we're facing hotter summers and smoky summers where people, don't want to have their windows open, I think there's opportunities to look at least making sure that those air conditioner installs are heat pump installs, and so you're sort of starting to chip away at this challenge already. But
presumably the right way isn't to cut checks to individual Canadians for $20,000 heat pump systems.
That would be not the most efficient way, for sure. That said, I mean, even if you do some, high upfront cost subsidization to start with, there are some interesting papers, in thinking of one by Eric Kittinger out of RIT, I think, where they looked at even some really expensive upfront subsidies in the very beginning of adoption of technologies. If you look at sort of what that does to maybe drive down the cost of adoption in regions, you actually can justify the cost of those subsidies for the broader benefits that they provide. But you better be very thoughtful about how exactly you're doing that.
David, was that a consideration in some of the choices that you made? Did you think of, if you're paying $1,000 per ton of a ton of CO2 abated in some of your design choices, we can argue it's green bling, and it's available, frankly, only to those who can afford it. And my solar system was, if not $1,000 per ton, it'd be high hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2 abated. But that you're helping to commercialize technologies, and you're creating the local know-how and the trades who can do this, and through doing that, you're driving down the cost of commercialization.
Yeah, for sure. That was part of the reason we made the choice, and I've, been meaning to, but haven't done it well enough. I'd like to find a better way to actually write up our story and kind of make some specifics available, because I think these sort of specific little learnings that are like community-specific, CANMORE-specific matter. And this stuff I mentioned about tying the dispatch of the thing to the grid carbon intensity is really very important. And I'd like to do a little pushing on that, because, this really is the limit. At night, the grid carbon intensity is relatively high in general, depends on how windy it is. And we're burning a lot of gas on that grid. And so there's a fundamental limit to how good a job you can do with heat pumps if you've got gas is the marginal electricity supply. So I think ways that we can do load shifting are crucial in a world where I guess I'm expecting we will not suddenly get to batteries that are so cheap that we store solar or wind for long periods. I think that's possible, but a long way away. In the meantime, it's really important to think about these various subtle ways to shift load to make the grid and the things that use it more adaptable in ways that can cost effectively save carbon. And in the end, the way to do that is kind of clear market signals that actually are tied to the carbon intensity of the grid, not just the electricity price. And that's doable, and that's a regulatory and public policy choice that would be one that should be kind of small c conservative, because it's about making the market transparent.
We will have to, unfortunately, give short thrift to energy storage systems in homes. I did see an article recently that Elon Musk, among his successful and somewhat failing businesses, I think X being in the latter category, formerly known as Twitter, the Powerwall business apparently is extremely profitable. And I don't know if it's because of very inelastic demand and that you just have consumers who want it and cap supply and they're prepared to pay anything for it, or something else. But apparently it's going guns blazing. So Dale, over to you, and I haven't given you your homework in advance. You're going to respond. But I would love to put you on the spot as someone who builds homes. Maybe you can blend into your response. Can we address this housing crisis that we have in Canmore while building for sustainability at the same time? Or is there inherent trade-off between the two And does the housing crisis actually take precedent over something like the climate crisis?
Thank you, everybody, for coming out, and thank you for the opportunity to be the respondent here. We were just chatting before we started. The respondent actually has a legal connotation. It's usually the person, a government, that's responding to a complaint. So I'm not here in that role by any means. But as I was listening to this excellent presentation, thank you very much, and I couldn't find a lot I didn't agree with. And I think what struck me was this is one of the first presentations I've heard over many years where people are actually getting down into what is the cost of the benefit per CO2, and with respect to the windows was a good example. And I think that's really what we need to get to is, and I challenged Gareth at a conference we were at a couple of weeks ago, is that I think most people, and especially in Canmore, we all understand climate change. We all know there's a problem, but we don't know what to do about it. And whether it's someone who's building a $6 million home or someone who's trying to get into a $600,000 townhouse, there's a limited amount of money they can spend. So where do they spend it? Do I spend it on insulation? Do I spend it on windows? Do I spend it on a heat pump? Geo-exchange? And for most people that I talk to, they don't know the answer to that question. Where's the biggest bang for the buck? And so I was really encouraged to sort of hear some of that conversation today. And if I'm going to respond, I think you're crazy to have bought those windows, but good for you, because it's your money, and it makes if that's what floats your boat, great. But I could never go to a client and say, spend the money on the windows. I'd say, no, spend the money on insulation, or think about geo-exchange or something else. So I guess that's my challenge to us as an industry, to us as a municipality, is let's keep the conversation going and talking about what makes sense, and then educating our building industry to implement those things. And I would love to put geo-exchange in every house that I build, but it's really, really hard, right? Jeff, it's really, really hard because it's not standard. And to find the plumber and the installer and everybody that even knows how to do it is hard. Right, Frank? Right? So that's the challenge, and that's my response. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. And I'm glad that you've agreed with what we've had to say, because typically an EV show is kind of like going into battle. You might all be here at the beginning, but not all of you will be here at the end. But thank you. You've all stuck through. We're going to open up to questions, but I want to turn to my colleague Sarah. She's got a quick response to the response.
Yeah, I don't know how far we can go with this. It's also largely an agreement, right? And I think what you said around this idea of, I said something about, you have to figure out what to tell people and what they're looking for, and the challenge of things not being standard. And I think that really is the real challenge in my mind over the next 10, 15 years in the building industry, is how do you make these things, how do you make them standard, how do you make them sort of obvious, and how do you make them clear for consumers? Because you're always going to have a handful of people like, my co-hosts and myself, and maybe some of the people that listen to our show who want to dig into the, how do I get this done? How do I figure this out? But the vast majority of people are looking for a home, and they want that home to be, a safe, comfortable, warm place to raise their family. And we're never going to get to the point of, mass adoption of these different technologies and options until it becomes, a clear and easy choice for people. And so I think that's what, the industry and the professionals have to do to be able to get us to that point where we can make that happen.
Yeah, so I'm going to open it up to questions. It isn't easy still as an individual homeowner. Someone to remain nameless who was in the Prime Minister's office for a donkey's age left, and she had a hand in putting in place, like a real direct hand, some of these policies that have incentivized all these programs and supports for greening one's house. And she called me up and said, Ed, I don't know what the F to do because I can't figure this out. I can't figure out how to tap into these programs that I myself have created and what technology choices to make. Okay, a preview of your keynote speaker tomorrow morning, my friend and old colleague, David Dodge. You have a question.
Hello. I've always wanted to ask a question of energy versus climate. Now I get a chance, and in front of an audience. That's awesome. Love what you guys do. So my first comment is I have a big problem with Suncor versus Canmore versus Toronto versus whatever, versus anything. Because, you know, the thing I learned in an interview recently, I was talking to somebody about this, about, well, what does Canada matter? We're 2% of world emissions. And this person had the best answer I've ever heard. Every ton counts. And that's all you got to say every time you face a stupid question about what we can do about this. But my real question is for David Keith, who I love because he's such a contrarian sometimes. He drives me to distraction. And he's so smart. David, would it have been more prudent, and the home builder, I think, agrees with me here, to save 50% on your windows, buy less windows, and buy solar financially? You talk about carbon emissions. Let's talk financially, which is how every homeowner makes their decisions. Would you have been better off financially building your home to trade off half your window cost, which you said was $200,000, so that's a big solar system for $100,000, and
I missed it.
Would you be better off financially had you done that, is my question.
Do you need the question repeated, David?
Sorry, I was told you need
I didn't quite get it. Windows versus what? I didn't quite get it. I'm sorry.
Versus solar. Solar.
On a capital cost basis.
Yeah. And sorry, I do have one more caveat here. I'm told a useful tool for you in putting solar on your home would be a chainsaw.
I missed that.
So the gist of it, there is a joke in there, which you can pick up when the pod drops a few days from now. But why spend like $200,000 of your building costs on windows when for half of that you could have put in a huge solar array and, you know, justify or give us more context for the decision that you made on windows versus a solar system?
Economics versus carbon.
Economics versus carbon.
So I think that solar in Canmore is also very expensive, of a similar order by the calculation. So maybe somebody in the room gave me a bunch of costs for some recent solar installations, and I did the math, and it came out really bad. And Ed tells me he's got no O&M, but Ed needs to tell me that again in 30 years. And also he needs to take account of cleaning, because real large commercial solar places do cleaning to keep the efficiency up. Ed may or may not go up on his roof, but he probably doesn't charge himself the cost of doing that. So I think there really are pretty solid data that suggest that if you want to get solar, residential houses is not generally the place to do it. Big flat roofed industrial buildings can make a lot of sense, but in general, I think this data is very strong. The capital and operating costs of per unit of delivered power are substantially smaller in big installations. And since the grid is efficient, it doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense to do local solar. To be clear, the price I quoted you was for the whole window package, which I didn't give. It's hard to figure out. So what's the extra we paid for that?
David, we finally have we finally have the Starlink gremlins have crept in, so I need to call to the stage Mayor Krausert to finish Dr. David Keith's answer.
Compared to one that was like
you promised. I see the mayor is sticking in his seat. Yeah.
Well, you know, I really appreciate that. I don't know about the data, but we do have lots of programs, including the energy efficiency program, where you can get funding. It goes with the house, and it's actually very accessible for people to be part of the grid. So.
Yeah, and just in response, I think we may have lost David to faulty Starlink. Think, satellite-based internet, and it stops working. Ugh, I can't believe it. On solar, so with my 3.9 kilowatt system on my roof in Canmore, it produces about 4,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. That's more than what we consume on an annual basis. So our house, and I did the same in Banff. I'm looking at Michael Hay from the town of Banff, and through the town of Banff piloted a municipal feed-in tariff program, the first municipal feed-in tariff program in Canada. So they did a different approach, whereas Canmore had a subsidy, and that was on top of the old provincial subsidy. So it took a $12,000 system and brought down my capital cost to about $8,000. Now, the payback is still long, because when I ran the numbers on my electricity charges, it decreased my electricity charges by about 28%. You've got a bi-directional meter, so you're selling at whatever you buy. But when you take in distribution charges and transmission charges, on a net basis, it's not a rounding error, but it's not far from a rounding error. Now, there are other programs. I've recently signed up to Solar Club, which is a government-subsidized program that gives you a higher rate, and I think it's 38 cents per kilowatt hour for the months when you're a net exporter. So think of like May to September, and then you buy at 13 cents per kilowatt hour when you're a net importer, and that's going to drop my payback considerably. But it's a long payback technology any way you look at it.
Ed, I mean, you're not counting the social cost, because you're taking money out of my pocket and everybody else's, because net metering basically is throwing away. You're then paying nothing for the immense value of the reliable grid. Net metering doesn't make sense as a large-scale policy.
Oh, but David, we have net billing here in Alberta. You've been outside of Alberta for too long. We're not like in the U.S. where we have net metering. We have net billing. So Ed actually is paying his full distribution costs for all the power that he imports. He's not like my father in California.
If that's right, then good.
But I have to correct you, Ed, on the how Solar Club is working. So the fact that you're getting this higher rate in the summer is actually not, unless there's a government subsidy I don't know about, which is very possible. It's actually the electricity provider, the utility that's buying power from the grid, is really just giving you a cut of the arbitrage of the fact that you're producing solar at a time when it's actually worth much more than that on the grid. So they're keeping their portion of that. But if you look at solar right now in Alberta, because we still don't have a lot of solar tends to command a price premium over the average grid price.
And I would love if we had time of day pricing, so that I could actually then, when I'm producing, sell at what that rate is, what the true market rate is, instead of being at the set rate. Okay, we're doing a lot of talking. We want to turn to questions. I'm going to pick on someone. I wonder if Donna Houston, if you want to put in a plug for a really interesting initiative that you've developed locally, a Canmore-based land trust. And sorry to put you on the spot. I'm not sorry, actually.
Okay, wow, thank you, Ed, so much. I'm Donna Houston. I am chair of a new local nonprofit for the Bow Valley called CANMORELAND Community Land Trust. This is a way to tackle not only the housing crisis, but all of the real estate and space crisis here in the Valley, one solution at a time. So we're looking at real estate from an entirely new avenue. Think altruistic monopoly.
Awesome. Okay, last call for questions.
Lawrence Hill, retired builder. To Dale's question about what really makes sense, hearing that cold temperature heat pumps are now possible, it would seem that the solution is relatively simple for future housing. We don't put in gas lines. We have electric lines. That supplies the surplus for, or makes up the difference when it's minus 28 or colder. And then you've got heat pumps doing the rest. We don't have to do geothermal. We don't have to pay $200,000 for windows. Maybe still $100,000. You want really good windows for sure. And you have nice thick walls, thermal bridging, and all of the rest, and possibly some mass to retain it. So, what am I missing? Isn't it relatively simple once we convince guys like Chris here to not put gas lines in? There's a big chunk of the savings that we need.
Yeah, it's. In some ways, I think it is fair to say a lot of the solutions are as simple as that. I think actually implementing them is more challenging, right? And there's places around the U.S. That have tried, and some of them have implemented gas bans for new construction. There's been a lot of pushback from predominantly the natural gas industry. And so, making those kinds of changes, I think, are not always easy. We of course have the existing building stock that we also have to manage, and that is significant and part of the challenge. But I do think that when it comes to new buildings, there, as David was saying, I think when you're looking at areas with more densification or in places that are, even colder, like up in the mountains, there are cases where the geothermal can make sense. But certainly from a policy perspective, trying to do what we can to shift new builds to be increasingly electrified, and then at the same time to decarbonize our electricity grid, that is a big chunk of the solution. And there is a sort of urgency of, the sooner we get the new build part right, the less existing building stock we are going to have to retrofit. So, what's the saying about when you're in a hole, stop digging? There's something to that when it comes to the building stock that we're constructing today. That, again, sometimes there's this sort of dichotomy of, well, if we need to build a lot of buildings, can we afford to build them in a way that is more energy efficient or that emits less carbon? And I think to that, I would say, there is a middle ground. One big piece of that is just the size of the buildings, the size of the housing stock that we're building, and certainly, smaller homes still big enough for people to live in, are also inherently lower carbon, and getting people off of fossil fuels that have more price volatility inherently does make them more affordable. So, I think it is a solvable challenge, but I don't want to overshadow the barriers that still exist in doing what you suggest.
Yeah, and I'll just offer a couple comments. One, tonight I've taken pot shots at the federal government for their absolutely asinine decision to exempt home heating oil from the carbon tax and then to write these overly lucrative checks to homeowners to install systems. Notwithstanding what my colleague Sarah said around sort of the economic efficiency of some of those checks. However, that is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The carbon tax can make a big difference on heat and on things like heat pumps. It has relatively a much smaller impact on things like individual consumers' willingness to buy electric vehicles. So we may not like it in parts of this province. We've told the feds, we're not going to do it, and we're going to let the federal government sort of tax us and then collect the revenues, which I think is giving up Alberta autonomy over that. I don't like that decision. But it really can make a difference, and we should keep that system in place. Second, it's one thing for us as individual consumers to pursue these high capital costs, high cost of abatement technologies. It's a whole nother thing when we think of return on investment to our effort and our time to lobby Sean Krausert, Wade Graham, Amy Fournier, Caitlin, others here in the room, and to say we need to build this into building codes. And that's going to be much bigger bang for your buck. Thanks, Dale. Yeah. And if you didn't hear that, and the mayor said we have to lobby the provincial government for exactly. Yeah. So if we can do these things individually, but we'll make a real difference if we actually spend our time and effort on these advocacy efforts and lobby the provincial government to force our municipalities or work with our municipalities on these building code changes. And I think that's arguably better ROI for time and effort.
So I know we're wrapping up here, and this is good segue, because one of the questions I know a lot of the people in the building development industry have is how do we balance off energy versus climate and affordability? And I know that has a provincial part of it. I know it has a federal part of it. One of the questions I hope that many of you think about in the room today and as we go forward tomorrow is how do we find that balance and make sure that we can deliver housing, deliver affordable housing that's also going to be responsible. And I think that's a big question for all of us, and I think there's a variety of ways to deliver housing. But as we go through tomorrow and as we wrap up tonight, I really hope we talk about what affordable housing looks like and how that pairs with sustainability initiatives going forward. So with that, I think we'll wrap up, and I'd just like to say thank you so much to the Energy versus Climate podcast, and thank you so much for participating tonight. Gareth, anything else I'm missing here?
Big hand for these wonderful individuals.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinijescu, with help from Crystal Hickey, Serena Gibson, and Talia Grinnell. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy vs. Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President, Research, and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. We'll be back for another special live taping of Energy vs. Climate in Calgary on November 22nd. Energy vs. Carbon removal will offer a deep dive into the still relatively new climate mitigation pathway. Check out our site for all the details, and we hope to see you then.